Hello and welcome to We Debate. I'm Joe Munene. Now, Kenya has been on a significant borrowing spree over the past 10 years. In 2012, public debt stood at 1.48 trillion shillings. Currently, it stands at 8.6 trillion, 6 times the 2012 figure. The debt to GDP ratio in 2012 stood at 38.2%. It currently stands at 68.4% and is projected to rise up to 70% at the end of 2022. In June, Parliament approved the raising of the debt ceiling from 9 trillion to 10 trillion shillings, a pointer to even more appetite for further borrowing. Is our public debt unsustainable, and are we risking a severe economic crisis? This is good for debate.
The debate motion for tonight. Let it be resolved. Kenya's public debt is unsustainable and the country risks a severe economic crisis as a result.
In the coming days, we are going to a place where we are going to auction some of the things that we have in Kenya. Also, because we have heard of the port being sold or being auctioned. So we just want to ask the government to use the resources that are available wisely.
The debt is quite unsustainable and it results into maybe the country economically not doing very well, because now we can't sustain our debts and our imports, because what really makes us spend a lot of dollars in importing petroleum products and maybe other value-added products.
I feel like we are focusing more on expenditure, and it's not wrong to borrow. Yeah, the thing is we are borrowing with a cause, and where money gets lost is how we spend it. So I feel like we need more controlling on how we spend it, and we have to prioritize what comes first, and actually the people who are overseeing projects.
And our debaters for tonight are: on the affirmative side of the debate, we have Ken Gishinga, Chief Economist at Mentoria Economics. On the negative side of the motion, we have David Ndii, Economic Advisor and Author.
Ken, David, welcome to this debate session.
Thank you. Thank you.
The motion before us is, let it be resolved, Kenya's public debt is unsustainable and we risk a severe economic crisis as a result. Ken, you're arguing on the affirmative side of this debate. David, you stand in opposition. Just a quick run through on the format. We will have 1 minute of your opening remarks. After the 1 minute, you will have about 4 to 7 minutes to give your main presentation on why you've taken this position on this debate. After the main presentation, you will have a chance to rebut against each other's arguments at that point. Now, as part of the format of these debates, we have a panel of jurors, 3 members on the jury panel, who I will now ask to take a vote on their position on this debate motion. And the idea is, at the end of the debate, we will poll the jurors again to determine whether they have been swayed by any of your respective arguments. Now, to our viewers back at home, we are also polling this question. Please let us know where you stand on this motion. Is Kenya's debt unsustainable, and are we risking a severe economic crisis as a result? And this is the jury's opening position on this motion. 2 out of the 3 jury members are in agreement with this motion. 1 of the jurors is against the motion. At the end of this debate, we will poll them and see whether, David, you've been able to win the other 2 to your side of this conversation. We start off with you, Ken, on the affirmative side. Your 1 minute opening remarks.
Many thanks, Joe. I'm here to support the motion that Kenya's public debt is unsustainable and risks posing a severe economic crisis to the country. But to have a meaningful debate on this issue, we must define what we mean by debt sustainability. And I believe there are 2 components to that definition. The first component is the conventional wisdom, which is a country's ability to service its obligations, both foreign and domestic, when the loans come due. But there's also a second definition, which is a bit more nuanced, which is about a country's ability to refinance its portfolio, which is far more complex, and I'll unpack it later. I'll be making the argument that the policy direction in Kenya today lacks the historical understanding of what has happened in Kenya in the past, lacks the appreciation of what's happening in Kenya today, and is founded on unrealistic expectations about the future. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ken. David, your opening remark?
Thank you very much. I am on this side that our debt sustainability is not in question, and I'll keep it simple. Whether you can sustain your debt depends on, as Ken said, your ability to pay. But your ability to pay also depends on your lifestyle choices. So, the situation we are in is one where you ask a question, is it your debt which is not sustainable, or is it your lifestyle? And my position that it's the lifestyle. So, if you think about it from a personal perspective, if you're living beyond your means, you have debt, so you're living in Muthaiga, which is not where your income allows you to live, perhaps what you should do is move house. You might even say, why do you have two cars? You need to have one car, perhaps even use public transport. That's what you should afford. So I will be articulating the argument that we have a lifestyle problem rather than a debt problem.
All right, all right. So it's not unsustainable because you can fix the lifestyle.
Exactly.
Okay. All right, we circle back to you, Ken. You now have 4 to 7 minutes to make your main presentation on the position that you have on this motion. Over to you.
Thank you very much. My argument will be anchored on 3 pillars. I'll look at the historical evidence around Kenya. I will take a look at our current situation, and I will also make insights into what I think are future expectations on the Republic. When we look at the historical situation in Kenya, first of all, it's important to know that Kenya has defaulted in the past. Sometimes I get shocked when I hear policymakers saying Kenya has never defaulted in history. In November 1991, Kenya defaulted on its debt. And it had very little to do about the economics at that time. It was very much about the political image, the policy image that Kenya had. So in November 1991, policymakers, the donor community decided to discontinue aid to Kenya because of the negative perceptions that Kenya has had. And it's important to also make the distinction that there are 2 types of debt, external debt. You have concessional debt. This is the debt that is coming from the IMF, debt that is coming from the World Bank. It comes with a lot of preconditions. But also you have commercial debt. But Kenya at that time was really anchored on concessional debt, the IMFs and the World Bank. So when the donors decided to pull out, not because of the economics, but very much because really of the geopolitics of the time, Kenya defaulted. But let's talk about Kenya today and really about the economics of today. When you talk to policymakers, one of the things they tell you is, Japan has debt to GDP of 200%. The US has debt to GDP of 100%. So why is Kenya a problem at only 70% debt to GDP? And I always say, well, those countries borrow in their own currency. The US will borrow in dollars, and Japan will borrow in yen. So they're not exposed to the exchange rate risk. But Kenya, 52% of our debt is anchored on foreign debt. So if the dollar slides, it's very, very possible that we might have that exchange rate risk. Another false assumption that is always presented is the fact that the Eurobond, they always say the Eurobond is oversubscribed. Every time you have a Eurobond, and they always say by that oversubscription, it means investors have confidence in the economy of the country. And I always say, no, that's also a false notion, because we've had about 21 Eurobonds in Africa, and all of them have been oversubscribed. And it's not really an appraisal on the macroeconomic conditions of a country. No, it's the fact that yield investors can get yield, which is very high, almost 1,000 basis points above the US Treasury, which they are unable to get in the West. Number two, our debt payments come out from the consolidated fund, and this is the fund that has the first check to the claim to the exchequer. When you have that, investors always know they have the confidence, even if a country can't pay its wages, even if a country is in a crisis, the fact that their debt is secure in the consolidated fund, it means that their debt is secure. So that's also another misnomer. But also another issue that comes up, they say, is, well, the Eurobond money is used to put into projects which generates revenue for the country. Again, I say, really? If you look at most of the revenue from the Eurobonds, they go into short-term recurrent pay expenditures. Very few of it go to projects that generate revenue. And that's the reason Kenya's debt over the last 10 years has gone up 5 times, but our tax revenues have gone up 3 times. The former commissioner, the Auditor General, I mean, he got gray hair just trying to explain where Eurobond money went. But lastly, about the future expectations, there's this understanding that our exchange rate to the dollar will remain stable. But that's also not sustained, because if you look at the dollar situation today, it's very untidy. The exchange rate is all over the place. So there's nothing to suggest that the dollar will remain at 120 or where it is today. The likelihood is it might appreciate, the shilling might depreciate. So we put ourselves in a situation where we're in a currency that's very, very unstable and might be able to pose debt risk. And lastly, when you think about the balance of payments of this country, you know, when you say debt is sustainable, it means you are generating enough exports, dollars, to be able to service your debt. But is that really happening? No. Kenya is becoming more of an import country. We used to even have a trade surplus with Africa. Now we have a trade deficit. So we're importing more. And even look at dollar remittances. The last 3 months, they are starting to reduce. So this whole idea that dollars, you'll have enough dollars, is unsustainable. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ken. Quite some insights there. We now have David. You are opening your main presentation, and then we'll go into rebuttals after David presents.
Okay, let's try and understand what has changed over the last decade about our debt structure. On the external side, historically, we have relied on concessional debt, which is primarily bank loans, term loans from international financial organizations and what we call ODA, Official Development Assistance. Now, these loans, like your bank loan, you repay interest and principal over a specified period. In 2014, we went to the market and floated a bond, the Euro bonds. We had never done that before because we couldn't. Poor countries are not able to do that. But some circumstances changed and we have become a middle-income country, and the markets are more willing to lend low-income countries like us because of they had a lot of liquidity from the monetary policies of the West. So we went into the market and started borrowing money there. Now, when you go to the market, you can get reasonably priced money, but it comes with what Ken has called refinancing risk. That when you go back to the market, you need to be able to roll over those debts. You never really set out to repay them. What you want to do is be rolling them over in the market. Then the other component, of course, what has changed is we adopted, the Jubilee administration adopted a growth strategy called infrastructure-led growth. So a lot of this money, what they said is for financing hard infrastructure. And of course, the biggest one of those is the SGR Railway, which we borrowed term loans, bank loans from China. Now, the situation we find ourselves in is one where, in fact, if you look at the composition of that debt, half of it is foreign, half of it is domestic, and they have increased pari passu in proportion. Now, if you look at the interest cost of that debt, 80% is domestic, only 20% is foreign. So domestic debt is a lot more expensive than foreign debt. Yeah? If you look at the budget for this year, the budget for interest is about 660 billion shillings, 530 is domestic, and only about 130 is foreign. So if you're to look at the debt burden, the biggest burden in terms of servicing is interest. Obviously, all domestic debt is market debt. There's no bank loan debt, so you don't do principal, you roll over your bonds and bills in the market, so you are more concerned about paying interest. So if you look at what that did is by borrowing domestically, the government took money, the loanable funds that are available in the banking system, that would constitute the working capital of business, and used it to finance infrastructure, long-term infrastructure. So you're taking short-term money and putting it into long-term capital projects. Short-term domestic money from the banks and putting it into long-term assets. So on the one hand, it means that the returns, if they come at all, will come in the long term. And on the other hand, you have denied that money to working capital of the private sector. And you see that hit SMEs very, very hard. So that is what I'm calling lifestyle. That is a lifestyle problem we have. We took short-term money and put it in long-term assets. We also went to the market. And when you go to the market, you expose yourself to refinancing risk. That at the time when you need to refinance your debt, the market conditions may have changed. And that's part of what we are facing. Now, but when we look at the first Eurobond we issued in 2014, we actually don't have to refinance it until 2024. So we have a year and a half. So although the market conditions have changed, we still have a year or more before the refinancing issue crystallizes. In between, you probably have other commercial, foreign commercial debts we call syndicated loans. They have the same character as the bonds. But the government has not been very good at disclosing these that are maturing. But again, what you need to do there is negotiate with the banks to be able to roll them over. But we are certainly nowhere near being unable to service, to pay the interest. As I said, if you look at the interest of foreign debt on all those loans, including those of the bilaterals and others, is about 20% of the total. So if we were to worry about cash flow and financing, what we would be then worrying about is domestic market debt, which is in shillings. And there is enough liquidity in the market that the government can keep refinancing that for a while. What we, however, have to do is change our lifestyle. What is not sustainable is our lifestyle. If we keep crowding out the private sector to finance long-term infrastructure, we are certainly going to end up in that lurch sometime down the road. But we still have time to change our lifestyle.
Ken, your opportunity to rebut on what you've heard so far from David, and then David will respond.
It's true, the interest rate payments are higher, but domestic debt is more controllable because it's in your own currency, number one. Funds are still retained within your country, number two. And that's why all the big countries almost entirely borrow in their own currency. Foreign debt is far more toxic because it's exposed to international events. Sri Lanka, as we speak, the primary reason they give, there are many reasons, but they say the COVID pandemic disrupted everything about the country. So think about the last 2 years. You've had the COVID pandemic, you've had the Russia-Ukraine war, possibly the two biggest events of our lifetimes, and none of this had been predicted. And that's how changing the world is. So the fact that you can't predict makes foreign loans far more toxic than domestic debt.
And they also come with a lot of conditions pegged to them?
They also come with a lot of conditions. And as I said, sometimes it's not even about the economics, even the image. You know, David here has publicly stated that corruption is not the biggest thing in Kenya. Now, if that view becomes the popular view, the donor community will take a view to Kenya and say, okay, Kenya is not serious about institutions. And the hard mindset within the donor community is very strong. When they leave, they leave. So Kenya's biggest crisis is with the external. It's not with the domestic. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Ken. David, you'll have a chance to rebut, but I just want to draw up some figures I looked up. A case study with Sri Lanka. GDP in 2019, $80 billion as compared to Kenya's 110 billion. Population, Sri Lanka 22 million, Kenya depending on what point you pick it, but projected at currently 51 million. GDP per capita, Sri Lanka, $3,682. Kenya, $2,115. Government debt to GDP, in 2019, Sri Lanka from 86% to 2021, 105, 110, I think by the time the chaos started. Kenya, currently we are projecting at 70%. Corruption ranking, according to Transparency International, of Sri Lanka, 2021 Corruption Perception Index, ranked 102. Kenya, 128, which means we are in a worse position. And then also, Sri Lanka was notable for its investments in big infrastructure projects, and had also experienced very good growth from 2013 to 2019. So maybe, David, when you look at just that comparison, and it could be just a layman's perspective, don't we have reason to worry that, and also Sri Lanka has borrowed heavily from the international institutions, the IMF, with their conditionalities. And we also know that we've been also picking up those loans. It's not abnormal, but given that comparison and what Ken is saying, how would you respond?
Now, the case of Sri Lanka and all those movements, the thing you have to factor in there, again, in terms of the market, that those are exchange rate movement things. Your debt is denominated in dollars, but your economy is in your local currency. So even without you borrowing an extra penny, if your currency depreciates, your debt to GDP ratio goes up. So when you see countries in distress and their debt to GDP ratios are going up very rapidly, it is not their debt which is rising. It is the value of their debt in foreign currency vis-a-vis their domestic economy.
All right.
That's already a crisis situation. So the crisis is already unfolding. So those numbers actually don't tell you very much because they are now crisis numbers.
So in your view, in the current economic state that we find ourselves, would you say we are in a sort of a crisis?
Let me give you a figure. When you talk about domestic and foreign debt and how you deal with it. Our current domestic borrowing cost is about 10%. Okay, that's how much the government is paying on average on domestic currency. The interest cost is 500 billion shillings, thereabouts. Okay? If you brought that down by 1 percentage point, by 100 basis points, you save 50 billion. If you brought it by if you brought that down from 10 to 2.5 to 7.5 percentage points, you save 150 billion shillings, enough to service your foreign interest. Now, those who don't know the history, when the NAC government came to office, we had exactly the same situation. our interest cost, government borrowing cost was 10%. We actually brought it down to 2% within a year and a half. It was probably too much, but even when it went back, it went up to only about 7. So one of the places where you can bring down your cost of debt very rapidly is by lowering the domestic cost of borrowing.
All right. Ken, you want to respond to that? And then David will have a chance to respond to that before we take the break.
I think Sri Lanka had the right strategy. They decided to lower their taxes because they believed that would trigger some fiscal stimulus into the economy. However, they reduced it by a lot, and the country didn't have enough income to be able to sustain it. So that is the problem that Sri Lanka faced. Does Kenya face the same challenge? I still believe we need to have a bit of fiscal stimulus. I think Kenya is highly overtaxed, and I do believe that is contributing to businesses underperforming and not having the sufficient revenue to be able to meet it. When it comes to our costs, our interest costs, domestic versus foreign, I do believe if you look at, 2014 is really when Kenya started getting commercial external loans. And if you really look at the state of the economy declining, it almost began around that year of 2014, 2015. So there's almost a direct correlation between our commercial external borrowings and the fragility of the economy. Yeah.
All right. David, you want to respond to Ken's?
Yeah. I'm very alarmed by my colleague here saying that Sri Lanka had the right policies, because what happened in Sri Lanka, briefly, if you allow me, is the Rajapaksas are the ones who caused the Sri Lanka to go into a debt crisis. When the port was taken over by China, they lost the election. Yeah, when they got the country. Then, in the next election, they came on a very populist platform. They promised to cut taxes and increase expenditure. So they promised to be all things to all people. And they won, because electorates are fickle. Mm-hmm. So the electorate believed that you could cut expenditure, cut taxes, and increase spending. And they started doing exactly that. They started where they had stopped. But of course, COVID came, all sorts of things came, and that's why the thing went belly up. But it went belly up because already the platform on which they had run was very reckless. Mm-hmm.
Cutting taxes.
To come back to power, yeah? No, cutting taxes and increasing expenditure at the same time. So running a bigger deficit. Mm-hmm. Yeah? They promised everybody, we will give you these, we will give you these, we will give you allowances, we will give you these, we will increase healthcare, we will increase, and then you promise business, we will cut taxes, you promised all things to all people.
All right. We take a short break at this point. That brings us to the halfway mark. In the second phase of this debate, you'll have a chance to cross-examine each other's positions, and then we'll cross the floor to the jury panel to ask you a series of questions. Well, we'll be right back. We take a short break at this point. Welcome back to the debate. We are talking Kenya's public debt. In this second part, we start off with cross-examination between the two debaters. With David, your chance to ask Ken a maximum of whether sequentially or question-answer format. And this is your chance to really weaken Ken's argument and his affirmative stance on this motion. Over to you, David.
My first observation and comment is about if we hold that Kenya's debt is unsustainable at this point in time, and we acknowledge that the bulk of the cost of the debt is domestic debt, what can be done then to bring down the cost of domestic debt? Secondly is to the question of that dichotomy between foreign and domestic debt that he raised. And to make the observation that when you have an open capital account, money can move in and out of the country freely. There is actually very little distinction between domestic and foreign market debt, because foreigners can invest in your domestic bonds, and in fact, Kenyan domestic bonds are very popular with the emerging market investors, shilling bonds. And similarly, Kenyans can invest in your dollar-denominated bonds. Domestic funds can actually invest. So again, do we really, if, for example, you have the kind of lack of, if you have a crisis of confidence, for example, God forbid, and then you have a run on the shilling, it is not just foreign dollars that will run. Even your own domestic money will run to safe havens. So do you really want to make that distinction? Because money has no sort of difference. If my shillings are at risk, I will put them in dollars. If whatever people do, it's really a portfolio allocation issue. So do we really want to be making such a big distinction between foreign and domestic, particularly when you're dealing with market debt? But they are more in a manner of observation. What's his thoughts on that in terms of thinking about the debt?
Okay, Ken?
I think those are really good questions. I think on the question of domestic debt, reducing domestic debt, that comes up quite a bit. And I've always said this is anchored on the size of government. And it's a political question. In the West, you have the right and the left. The right are always for a smaller state, and the left is always for a bigger state. Our politics hasn't matured to that level, but we do need to get to a place where we start thinking about the cost of government. One of the challenges Sri Lanka faced was they reduced quite a bit of their spending. I've never been for reducing our spending. I've said for the next 3 years, let's retain our budget as it is. Let's not expand it. Let's retain it. But what we can do is let's raise our revenue. So for the next 3-4 years, we turn from a budget deficit into a budget surplus. I feel if we can do that, we can reduce the cost of government, we can reduce the cost of borrowing, and ultimately interest rates come down, and the private sector is able to access rates. And actually that's what happened during the Kibaki days. As David had said, interest rates reduced dramatically, and banks had no option but to really lend to the private sector. On the issue of the dichotomy, David asks, is it important to make a distinction between foreign and domestic debt? And I do say yes. And it's the reason, as I said, all the big countries borrow in their own currency, because they are in control. In the worst case scenario, you can print your way out of debt. And that's what the US has done. That's what Japan does, what they call quantitative easing. But you can't control foreign currency. If you have a foreign currency shortage, if you talk about Kenya's situation right now, your typical manufacturer right now has to have about 10 different bank accounts with 10 different banks, because each bank is giving them a quota on what they can get in terms of dollars. So when you have a dollar shortage, the risks are far more profound, and it's in the best interest we reduce the ratio of our foreign debt to at least maybe 70% domestic and 30% foreign.
David, has he responded sufficiently?
Actually, I think one of two things. Let me start with the second one. I think every one of the rest of us, when you look at the wedge between domestic and foreign interest rates, I was having a chat with the bankers in London a couple of months ago, the people who lend us Eurobonds, and asked them, if you removed our political risk and macro risk, where would you position us in terms of the sort of yields on our bonds in the market? And they told me Morocco. which is to say that if we were to fix our political risk issues and have sound macro policy, we would be borrowing at about 400 to 500 basis points, 4 to 5%. And it's very unlikely that we can bring our domestic interest rates to that level. So my own perspective is that what we need is sound macroeconomic policy so that we can actually be able to, if you have stability, you can borrow cheap. On the first question of domestic interest, I want to invite another possibility you need to think about. And you want to think about conflict of interest. That if you look at owners of banks in this country, you have owners of banks on both sides of the market. They sit in government as borrowers, and they sit in the market as lenders to government. So part of the reason why our domestic interest rates are higher than they should be is because the borrower is, the people who are borrowing on our behalf are conflicted. Their interest is in the other side. So one of the things that actually can bring down our cost of domestic borrowing is removing that conflict of interest. You should not be borrowing and lending for the government and lending it at the same time.
All right. Ken, your 2 questions to David.
David makes the point that when you look at foreign debt, it's exposed to, you're more subjected to discipline because one wrong utterance, one wrong news item will lead your bond yields to go much higher. The same David, has been quoted by the Telegraph as the anti-corruption campaigner in Africa. But when you look at David's public statements in the last 1 year, he's changed a bit. He said corruption is not a big deal. We need to prioritize the economy, as if the two are not connected. I would like to ask David, what motivated the change of heart on fighting corruption?
We have reduced the debate on corruption to an animal farm type debate. 2 legs good or bad, 4 legs good. So that there are no more nuances. And corruption is a cure-all, is a word which is used by people who have no content on other things. Yeah? They have no content on other things. So they are using that corruption is the only problem in Kenya to cover up the lack of content. That's what I've been fighting. I have been fighting this dumbing down of our national conversation to a single issue of lobby. Just the same way you have some people who harp onto the environment and they say the only thing is climate change. You can't think about anything else. Once you open your mouth to talk about health, they talk climate change or gender or whatever. I am against single issue, sort of reductionist arguments which reduce things to single issues. But even maybe more controversial, the Kibaki government came, I was part of it, we came to power partly on a platform of fighting corruption. That same government, my friends, they drove their anti-corruption to exile within a year. Yeah? But today, people say that the Kibaki government is the one which delivered. Is the one which delivered most. So the issue of what do we mean unpacking? What I have been trying to get us to do is to unpack what is corruption and how should we deal with it. I think the debate on the table today is whether we should approach it institutionally and let the institutions strengthen the institutions that should fight corruption so that they can hold the executive to account, or those people who are saying that once you elect me, I will jail all the corrupt. You do not, it is not your job. In fact, it is, you are the person who should be watched. The executive cannot police itself. So I have not changed my position on corruption What I have been trying to fight is dumbing down the conversation so that we do not have a meaningful conversation about this, we just have a chorus.
So we are saying irrespective of where it's happening, it needs to be spotlighted, it needs to be dealt with because it has an impact on the economy. Whatever sort of corruption is there.
I think that, look, let me talk about, you gave the example of Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
If you look at, since the anti-corruption, the perception index was started, one country which has been at the bottom of that index below us is a country called Bangladesh. It has below us all the time. It has below us on other indicators like infrastructure and all sorts of things. And that country has overtaken us like a full bus over the last 2 decades in terms of the economy because of having sound economic policies despite corruption. Mm-hmm. And it's not the only one. Mm-hmm. So again, we don't want, once you start saying that, people don't want to have that nuanced conversation. They want to speak corruption like as if in a religious context, almost like either you are for or against sin. That's not how you have public discourse.
Ken?
It's a challenge listening to David here because when you think about the economic performance of Kenya over the last few years, it's difficult to understand why David would suggest that our economic thesis really is about the concentration of capital. And that's true, that's one area. But you don't hear David talking about monetary policy. You don't hear him talking about fiscal policy. He never writes about maybe a central bank digital currency. His only thesis really is around one family, and that is the beginning and the end of Kenya. My concern is, could that have clouded his analysis on what really affects the Kenyan economy? And I like it to raise about Bangladesh because monetary policy is a far more important issue than concentration of capital. Even if concentration of capital was in a few hands, but money was circulating in the economy, businesses do function, businesses do grow. So my question to David is, why has he reduced this debate to almost a personalized attack?
Okay.
Thank
David,
you.
and
I'm
that's
afraid,
your second question?
Yeah.
All right, David.
I'm afraid I don't want to teach economics here. But monetary and fiscal policy are stabilization instruments. Therefore, maintaining economic stability, and therefore they deal with the short term. Mm-hmm. Okay, fluctuations of output and employment. And they are largely important instruments in full employment economies, which is advanced economies in the world. Yeah, that's why they're so. If you are a full employment economy, you are concerned with short-term unemployment issues. Yeah. Okay, developing countries and low-income countries, your fundamental question is how to engineer an economic takeoff. So what you're looking for is structural change. Fiscal and monetary policies do not give you structural change. Structural change comes from structural policies. Now, the political economy of concentration of capital is what is preventing us from doing structural change. And the place to get Exhibit 1 is to go to session paper number 1 of 1986, which stated very clearly that this highly concentrated capital in the formal economy is something we need to change because it takes 16,000 pounds at the time, 300,000 shillings, equivalent of 2 million shillings today, to create one job in the corporate formal economy. And therefore, even if we put all our savings there, by the year 2000, we will have 6 million unemployed young people. This is a session paper written in 1986. They then said, we must therefore shift capital, our savings allocation, to informal sector and small-scale agriculture. That's the structural change policies that I'm talking about. You can talk fiscal and monetary things up here because it's exciting for financial market people, but it is actually not fundamental in terms of structural change.
Okay, I'll now take it to the side of the jurors. We have a panel of 3 jurors. We will get a series of questions. We'll start with juror number 1 at the far end. You have a maximum of 2 questions to ask. If you have 1, it's okay as well. We start with you. Give your name and also the person to whom you're directing your question to.
Thank you, Joe. My name is Chachelo Gutu. I have questions to each of our debatants. My first question is to Dr. David Ndei. You've mentioned a number of times that a way of sorting out this issue is to try and reduce the cost of the domestic debt. And for market participants, how you are proposing it, like the reduction of the interest cost, is something that you seem achievable. Don't you think that it will bring some financial repression in the context that we have different variety of market participants, bondholders, say the pension funds, and there's an implication if you reduce the interest cost of the debt, the pension funds, the interest cost of domestic debt, which will have on the pension funds who hold domestic debt. Don't you think that that will be an issue? Because this is something that is a recurring issue even amongst the market participants, which is currently playing out over the last couple of months. My second question is to Mr. Ken Gishinga. In your early submission, you mentioned around policy direction is lacking. And I would like to understand where did the ball drop? Is it National Treasury, the ones who comes up with the policy? Is it the regime of the day? Or is it Parliament who has the oversight in issues to do with public debt? So who dropped the ball in terms of addressing these issues around public debt in Kenya? Thanks.
All right, thank you. I think we'll start with David.
Thank you. Now, if you look at the domestic debt, over 80% is commercial banks. Yeah? But if you also look at the argument that the government should pay our domestic debt holders high interest out of tax money so that they can have high yields, I think that's not a tenable argument. It is not in the business of government to support the financial markets with high yields. But if you go to the banks, then you want to look at the spread between what they pay on deposits and what they are charging government. If you look at the deposit cost of deposits is something like 2 to 3%, and you are charging government 10%. What have banks done to earn an 8% risk-free spread? Yeah? What business have you done? So if you're earning a 7-8% risk-free spread, it does not make sense to lend to risky customers. Yeah? You just sit back and make an 8% risk-free spread. So then the question you ask, if citizens are lending banks at 3% and banks are lending me at 8%, why don't I borrow from citizens at 5%? As a government. You know, why should I allow middlemen to make such a huge spread out of the same taxpayers? So that is the way I would then ask you to look at the issue. Now, the fact that and that's why I talked about conflict of interest. You have people on the side of banks who are making huge amounts of money by earning huge spread, by gouging the public on interest they pay on deposits and gouging the public by how much they lend government.
Let me chip in there on that issue of conflict. We had the interest rates, the capping of the interest rates, the attempt which later had to be reversed. Wouldn't you say that that was actually a government that was keen to protect the small businesses, only that for whatever reason, whether it's the same government went and borrowed, but it almost goes contra to the position that you're taking, that there's a conflict of interest. How would you explain?
Okay, let me tell you what happened. If you look at the graphs, we don't have them here. What happened is in 2014 to 2015, that's when government domestic borrowing just went through the roof. And it was crowding out small businesses. The market response to that would be for interest rates to rise, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So the banks then started pricing loans to small businesses accordingly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because interest rates were rising. They should rise if the government comes in and takes a huge chunk of money. Then government started feeling political heat from businesses because interest rates were going up. Government's response to feeling the heat, having caused the problem in the first place, was to try and cap the rates. Okay, so the rate capping was a populist response to a problem that the government itself had caused. What then happened is that the banks could not price risk anymore. So they stopped lending to small businesses completely. That was the unintended consequence of that policy.
There was a question to Ken. You still recall your question?
Yes, indeed, and that was an excellent question, Churchill. And your question was, how did we get into these debt issues? Where did the rain start beating us? And who is responsible for it? That's a complex question, and I think it has multiple layers. I think the first layer has to do with the education of the policymakers. If you look at most economists in Kenya, most of their training is what we call Keynesian economics, really, which really subscribes to government spending, big government spending, and driving up growth, which was a big thesis in the early 20th century. But that was quickly overtaken by, what we call the Friedmans of this world, who really said it's actually businesses that drive growth, not government. So it's monetary policy that is more important. So I think it's the more training of our policymakers has been on the Keynesian, and that's why you find public spending. The other layer is the political culture. When your typical politician in Kenya wants to rise to power, he wants to promise that you'll have free education, free health, free security. You see it every day. And that's even the challenge that legislatures, such as the MPs, face. The fact that they say they go to their constituents and their constituents ask them, what have you done for us? So there's that idea that a politician should be able to have access to the public purse to expand it. And lastly, it's the corruption culture. It's far easier to steal money from big projects. You looked at the mega projects that have been examples of siphoning. It's much harder to misappropriate funds from businesses because those are left at the mercy of the business owners. So I think those three have come together to contribute to this idea of we need a bigger government and to really perpetuate big deficits and big debt. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Churchill. We'll now take questions from Winfred.
My question goes to Dr. David Ndi. It seems that our public debt is susceptible to a lot of changes. For example, the possible change in government regime that is coming up. And armed with the lessons that we have learned right now on how to manage our debt, and even the alluding to lifestyle choices that you have made, how is the common mwananchi protected from some of these changes?
Unfortunately, you cannot be protected from things which you are partly responsible for. You probably heard me say that choices have consequences, and financial delinquency has no solutions, only consequences. The ordinary mwananchi was part of the cheerleading squad for mega infrastructure projects. I think what, if anything, is to come out of this is for the ordinary person to understand the connection between political choices, political policy choices, and the financial consequences of choices that we make. That's the thing that can come out of it. Like Ken is saying, here you have to then begin to understand the difference between governments which promise you everything and they're not telling you how you're going to pay for it. So that you ask the question, how are we going to pay for that? That's the question that we have to ask politicians. So and I think here the role, the most important people here are the interlocutors, media, civil society. I think for more than 8 years, I was a lone ranger, warning about the consequences of the expensive borrowing we are doing and the mega infrastructure projects, and I was told, you even opposed Thika Road, and look now how wonderful it is. So I think this is, and fortunately this is, I think, part of the discourse in every country. It's part of a democratic discourse. So what we need to do is mainstream this conversation about financial responsibility in our politics.
All right. So we move to the last juror, Japheth. Your one question, it now has to go to Ken to balance out the two questions.
Yes, okay.
All right, over to you.
Thank you. And I think I'll split it into two. It might be two questions. My first one has to do with your comments on the options that are available. You talked of quantitative easing, which you defined as printing money, which to me sounds a risky recommendation. I don't know whether you support it or not. That also didn't come out clearly. And is it just printing money, or is it purchase of assets in order to inject liquidity to the economy? And then the second one, would you agree that we have possibly not exhausted the options available between concessional and market debt, and therefore we really don't have a debt crisis? What we have is a policy crisis and a lack of the political will to get the right mix for our debt. Over to you.
Many thanks for those questions, Japheth. In terms of policy options for Kenya, I think we just need to decide that debt is a problem and we need to start reducing our debt. Because as I said, debt either crowds out the private sector or it exposes you to international risk, particularly on your exchange rate. On the issue of quantitative easing, that's a tool used in the States. You see, in the States, interest rates were next to zero. So they had no other option but to start printing currency because there was no further latitude to reduce interest rates. In Kenya, we don't have to go that way. Our interest rates are very high. We can still slash interest rates. So quantitative easing or the printing of money only works in economies where interest rates are zero. Japan, the US, and they need some stimulus. But in African countries where interest rates are very high, absolutely not. All we need to do is reduce our interest rates and trigger stimulus into the economy. On the issue of concessional versus market, have we explored the possibilities in all? Well, both of these two debts have a challenge. As we said, market debt is very expensive. It weighs down the public purse. And concessional debt has a number of strings attached. So for example, if the new regime came in and the new Minister of Finance says, we are done with the IMF policies. I know Kenya is in the middle of an IMF policies. We are abandoning those and we are coming up with our own strategy. What will very quickly happen is the World Bank will freeze loans to Kenya. Now they do say that the IMF and the World Bank are in two different universes. They don't talk to each other, but that's not true. If the IMF gives you an F, World Bank really will not fund those policies. So what will quickly happen is the donors will run away and you'll quickly jump into debt, so into your defaults. So the sooner we can reduce both the concessional debt and the commercial debt, the better. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, jurors, for your questions. And now we go to closing statements. We'll come back to you, Ken, your 1 minute closing statement, and then we close the debate with David.
Problems, and we need serious solutions. If you look at our fiscal policy over the last 30 years, it's greatly diminished. It's put together a debt profile in which is unsustainable for the country. It's meant the business environment has been very difficult. It's meant we've ended up with a very high tax regime, and it's meant that the possibilities of wealth creation have rapidly diminished over the years. My request is for the judges and the audience to really consider the state of the economy in Kenya today, how precarious our situation is, and to be able to agree with me that our public debt is unsustainable and poses serious economic risks to the country.
Thank you, Ken. David, your closing 1 minute.
Thank you. I would like to start by really asking that we step away from this Keynesian monetarist kind of conversation, which I hear from my colleague, because those are a discourse of advanced market economies, about stabilization and about full employment economies, sort of mature advanced market economies. It clouds the conversation quite a lot because many people don't understand context. And I'm afraid to be teaching economics. The fundamental problem of development, economic development, was framed very nicely by Arthur Lewis about 60 years ago as the question of how an economy which was previously saving 5% of GDP turns to an economy which is saving 10, 15% of GDP or more. In other words, it's a question of accumulating capital. So the question of development is asking, how do you equip your workers to be productive? Because if you look at the difference between developed and developing countries, is that the capital per worker of Korea today is 100 times the capital per worker of Kenya. Yet they were similar not too long ago. How did Korea get its capital per work to be 100 times that of Kenya? It's through investment. And Keynesian monetarism, those things are completely irrelevant in that conversation. In fact, what we've been trying to do with this borrowing was a government which feels pressure to increase investment. But they did not think through the financing of it because they were feeling the political pressure because you have a huge workforce of young people joining the labor force. And they didn't understand how do you create jobs for these people. And then they decided that the way to do it is build mega infrastructure. But in fact, the infrastructure they were building is to support existing businesses. So the question that we have to go back to is that question posed by Arthur Lewis. How do we equip our youth with the capital so that they can be more productive? That's the fundamental question. It's the question that got us into debt.
All right. Thank you. We are at the end of this debate. A big thank you to our two debaters, David and Ken. Key insights. It was a heavy topic, but I think you guys have tried to simplify it. But have you done enough to sway the jurors?
At the beginning of the debate, 2 jurors were in support of the motion. 1 juror was against. Have the debaters managed to win over the jurors with their argument?
Well, the jury's verdict is in. At the tail end of these debates, the jurors' position is that 2 of the jury members are still in support. 1 is against. That's it for this edition of We Debate. Thank you once again to our debaters, members of the jury, our location host, the Norfolk Hotel, the KTN team behind this production, as well as you, the viewer, for staying tuned and participating in this important conversation. I'm Joe Munene, and I'll see you at the next debate.